Why did Jesus use money to explain honor your parents? Almost every Christian can recite the fifth commandment without opening a Bible. Honor your father and your mother. We learned it young, usually with a small lesson attached. Don't talk back, do what you're told, be respectful. So when Jesus decides to give an example of someone breaking that command, we already know the kind of story we expect. A child who yells at his mother, a son who slams a door, a daughter who mocks her father in public. That is not the example Jesus chooses. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus is in the middle of an argument with religious leaders about tradition, and he reaches for the fifth commandment to make his point. He quotes it plainly, "Honor your father and your mother." Then he describes the person who breaks it, and the offense is not an insult. It's not disobedience. It's not a raised voice. It's this: a grown man tells his parents that whatever they might have received from him is Corban. And after that, Jesus says the man is no longer permitted to do anything for his father or mother. Something the parents could have benefited from simply never reaches them. Jesus treats that as nullifying the command of God. Notice what just happened. He could have illustrated dishonor a dozen obvious ways. He picked withheld resources. The title of this video says money because that's the shortest way to point at it, but the passage is actually broader than coins. It's about material benefit, support, provision, something that could have helped an aging parent, held back. Picture an elderly hand, open, waiting, and picture what could have filled it, never arriving. Hold that image. We'll come back to it more than once, and it will mean something different by the end. But before we can understand why Jesus' example feels so strange, we have to be honest about what most of us assume the commandment means in the first place. If you ask a room full of Christians what it means to honor your parents, you'll hear a consistent set of answers, and none of them are wrong. Obey them, speak respectfully to them, don't shame them or curse them, don't roll your eyes when they talk. These are real expressions of honor. Scripture genuinely supports them, and this video is not going to take them away from you. The problem is not that the familiar reading is false. The problem is that it may be too small. Because watch what Jesus does. He takes this command that we've filed under respectful behavior, and he connects breaking it to what a person does with his resources when his parents need him. Honor, in his example, isn't only something you feel or something you say. It's something that shows up in your hands. So here is the direction of the answer, early, so you know this study has somewhere to go. Biblical honor was never limited to polite speech and childhood obedience. It could become tangible. It could cost you something. And Jesus exposes a practice where religion itself was being used to avoid that cost. Now be careful with that. The reframe is not, honor means money. That swings too far in the other direction and shrinks the command just as badly, only from the opposite side. The point is that honor can reach past the mouth and into the hand. Respectful words come from the lips. Practical care requires an open hand. Keep both in view, because Mark 7 is going to hold them together in a way that's easy to miss. Lips that speak and a hand that stays empty. Which raises the obvious question: was Jesus inventing a bigger meaning of the commandment on the spot? Or was that meaning already sitting inside the biblical world, waiting for someone to point at it? To find out, we have to go back, past Jesus, all the way to Sinai. The command shows up in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. In Hebrew, it opens with the word kabbed, honor your father and your mother. Now, you may have heard someone get excited about the root behind that word, because the wider Hebrew root can carry ideas of weight and heaviness, and from there it's tempting to say the command literally means make your parents heavy. That's the kind of claim that sounds impressive and quietly falls apart. In this verse, kabbed simply functions as the ordinary command to honor. The theology has to come from how the word is actually used, not from prying a hidden meaning out of a root. But there is a useful and honest picture in the background. To honor someone is to treat them as weighty, as significant. as someone whose position and needs carry real weight in your decisions. The opposite of honor in that light isn't just rudeness, it's treating a parent as light, disposable, someone whose needs don't register on the scale. And Scripture doesn't stop with one word. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3, Israel is told to revere father and mother, and that's a different Hebrew term entirely, one tied to fear and awe. So the Torah itself refuses to flatten the parent-child relationship into a single English synonym. There's honor, there's reverence. They overlap, but they're not identical, which already tells us that reducing the whole thing to one tidy definition was never the biblical plan. Then there's a line in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 22. Do not despise your mother when she is old. Sit with the word old for a second. That single detail quietly moves the entire conversation out of the nursery. The mother has aged, which means the child is no longer a child. He might be a grown man with a household of his own, and the command still has its hand on his shoulder. The relationship didn't expire when he moved out. And here's a detail most people never notice. The fifth commandment does not contain the word obey. It says honor. That doesn't make obedience irrelevant, especially for a child living under a parent's roof. But it does mean that equating the whole command with a kid doing what he's told is too narrow. The stone stays the same across a lifetime. The little child becomes an adult. The strong parent slowly becomes frail. And the command just stands there, between them, refusing to shrink. So what does honor look like when the child no longer needs the parent, and the parent starts needing the child? To feel the weight of that, you have to understand the world these words landed in. There was no pension system, no retirement fund. No state-run elder care, no nursing homes, no safety net waiting to catch a parent who could no longer work. When strength failed and income stopped, there was essentially one institution standing between an aging parent and disaster, and it was the family. So material support in that world was not abstract. It was food on a plate, a cloak against the cold, a roof, a hand under an arm on the way for a doorway, the daily, unglamorous labor of keeping a weakening person alive and cared for. To withhold that wasn't like skipping a birthday gift. It could mean hunger. And this understanding of the command did not begin with Jesus. There's a Jewish writing called Sirach from the wisdom tradition, written before Jesus was born. For Protestants, it isn't part of the Old Testament canon, so I'm not using it to prove doctrine. I'm using it the way a historian would, as evidence of how Jewish people were already reading these commands. And Sirach chapter 3 is striking. It tells a person to honor his father in word and in deed, and then it goes further. It tells him to help his father in his old age, and to stay patient with him even when his mind begins to fail, even when his understanding slips away. That's centuries before Mark 7, and already a Jewish reader could hear honor your father and understand it to include care for him when he can no longer care for himself, even when it's hard, even when he no longer fully knows you. Some scholars go further and argue that the fifth commandment was aimed first at adult householders rather than small children, precisely because of situations like this. I won't tell you that settled fact, but the evidence that its relevance extends deep into adulthood is strong, and it fits everything else we're seeing. Before we walk into the strangest part of the story, one quick thing. If studies like this one are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing genuinely helps the channel reach the people looking for exactly this. That's it. Now, let's get back to it. Because there's a single word in Mark 7 that changes the whole scene. The word is Corban. Mark actually preserves it in the original and then, almost like a footnote, explains it for readers who wouldn't know the term. Corban, he says, means a gift, an offering, something dedicated to God. Here's the basic idea, without drowning in the technicalities of ancient vow law. A man could take some portion of his resources and place it under a sacred dedication. He could pronounce it Corban, devoted, set apart with God's name attached to it. And once he did, the effect Jesus describes is simple and devastating. His parents could no longer receive the benefit they otherwise might have gotten from it. Now, I have to be careful here, and I'd rather be careful than exciting. There's a popular version of this story where the man dumps all his money into the temple treasury and leaves his parents to starve while priests count the coins. The honest truth is that the historical mechanics are disputed. We can't confidently say every Corban declaration meant assets immediately went to the temple. In some understandings, the man might even keep controlling the property while simply blocking his parents from ever benefiting from it. Scholars genuinely disagree on how these vows worked in practice. But Jesus' point doesn't depend on settling that. It only depends on one thing, and the text states it plainly. The parents were cut off from help they could have received. Whether the resource went up in smoke on an altar or sat untouched in a barn, the elderly hand stayed empty. So go back to that image. The parents' open hand, the resources in the middle, the temple somewhere in the background. And now, over those resources, one word settles like a seal: Corban. The help hasn't vanished. The parents' access to it has. And here's what makes it worse, not better. The thing standing between the parent and the help is not an openly selfish sentence. The man doesn't say, "I don't feel like it." He says something that sounds holy. He invokes God. That's what makes the whole thing so slippery, and it leads straight into the hardest question in this passage. Wasn't dedicating something to God a good thing? Because vows were serious business in Israel. This isn't the Pharisees inventing a scam out of thin air. In Numbers chapter 30, verse 2, the law is explicit. When a man makes a vow to the Lord, he must not break his word. The Torah treats voluntary vows as binding. To pledge something to God and then casually take it back was itself a sin. So the tension in Mark 7 is not God's command against some obviously wicked practice. It's sharper and more uncomfortable than that. It's what happens when one genuine religious obligation gets interpreted in a way that quietly destroys another obligation God clearly gave. Keep your vows to God. Honor your father and mother. Both real, both commanded. And a tradition had grown up that let the first be used to erase the second. That's the actual problem, not simple greed, misordered devotion. A person could stand there appealing to God with one breath, while in the same breath evading something God had directly asked of him. And you can feel why Jesus finds this so serious. The more sacred the vow sounds, the sharper his accusation becomes. It would be one thing to catch a man cursing his father. It's another to catch a man dodging his father's needs while wrapping the refusal in the language of worship. Two obligations sit side by side. A vow to God must be honored. Honor your father and mother. Jesus isn't asking which one is fake. He's asking whether one can be twisted to cancel the other. And that is exactly why the opening of Mark 7 matters so much, because Jesus has already told us what kind of honor he's confronting. It starts at the mouth. Here's the discovery that once you see it, you can't unsee. It's the kind of thing you can read a dozen times and walk right past. Just before the Corban example in Mark 7 verse 6, Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah against the religious leaders. This people, he says, honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Honor with the lips. Then a few verses later, in verse 10, he quotes the commandment, honor your father and your mother. In the Greek, that's the same verb both times, timaō, honor. I want to be measured about this because it would be easy to overplay it and start claiming the word secretly means pay. It doesn't. The point isn't a hidden meaning in the vocabulary. The point is the literary repetition, and it's deliberate. The same word for honor sits in both sentences, and the passage bends them toward each other. Watch the sequence line up. Their lips claim to honor God. God's own command tells them to honor father and mother. And then their lips pronounce a single word, Corban, and their parents lose the benefit. Honor with the lips toward God, dishonor with the hands toward parents. And the hinge between them is a religious word spoken out loud. Lips, Corban, empty hands. That's the spine of the whole thing. The Corban problem was never merely financial. It was religious speech divorced from obedient action. A man could say the most sacred-sounding word in the room and still miss completely what God actually required of him. The mouth performed devotion, while the hand withheld it. Close up on a mouth, forming the word, cut to an old, empty hand. That's Mark 7. But Mark isn't the only gospel that records this confrontation.
Matthew tells it too, and Matthew says the quiet part out loud. In Matthew chapter 15, verses 3 through 6, we get the parallel account. Same dedicated gift, same withheld support. But Matthew draws the line straight through it. He explicitly ties the failure to provide for the parent to a failure to honor them. Where Mark gives us the striking word Corban, Matthew hands us the plain logic. To deny your parent that benefit is to not honor your father. This matters more than it might seem, because it means the connection between honor and material care isn't something we're importing from outside the text. It doesn't rest on a Hebrew root or on rabbinic writings from centuries later or on a modern theory of elder care. It comes from the mouths of the gospel writers describing what Jesus said. And still, hold the precision. Jesus does not redefine honor as money. He doesn't hand us a formula.
What he does is demonstrate that material responsibility can be one real expression of honor, one that a sacred-sounding vow was being used to escape. So look at that open hand again. When this study started, it just looked like someone asking for cash, and Jesus talking about money felt out of place. By now, the hand means something larger. It's asking a question. What does honor look like when another person's genuine need makes a claim on what I'm holding? And if that's truly woven into the fifth commandment, we'd expect the idea to surface elsewhere in the New Testament. It does, twice, and in two different ways. The first is in Ephesians chapter 6. Paul writes to children, "Obey your parents in the Lord," and then right after he quotes the commandment, "Honor your father and mother." Two different words sitting next to each other. Obey, honor. Don't rush past that pairing. Paul doesn't treat them as identical.
For a child under a parent's authority, obedience is obviously one way honor shows up. But he distinguishes the concepts, and the distinction is a gift, because it answers a question adults quietly carry. Does honoring my father mean a 50-year-old must obey his elderly parents' every preference like a boy of 8? No. Obedience belongs especially to the season of childhood authority. Honor is broader, and it outlasts that season. It keeps going long after the relationship of command and obedience has changed shape. The second passage is stronger still. 1 Timothy chapter 5. Paul is dealing with widows in the church, vulnerable women with no means of support, and he lays down a principle. If a widow has children or grandchildren, those family members should learn to practice godliness toward their own household first, and to make some return to their parents and grandparents, because this pleases God. And then Paul turns severe. Anyone who does not provide for his relatives, and especially his own household, has denied the faith. Read that against Corban and feel the reversal. Corban created a false choice. This belongs to God, therefore my parents can't have it. Paul obliterates the choice. Caring for your own dependent family isn't a rival to devotion. It is devotion. It's a way of practicing godliness. The exact responsibility Corban was used to dodge, Paul calls faithfulness. And look at the word he reaches for. Return, repayment. Caring for aging parents isn't framed as charity you might offer a stranger if you're feeling generous. It's framed as returning something to the people who once carried you. the picture from the beginning of life gets reversed at the end of it. The hand that once fed the child is now the hand reaching out, and the grown child's hand is the one that fills it. By this point, the main biblical case is on the table, from Sinai to Paul, which means it's time to ask the dangerous question, the one that keeps a discovery like this from curdling into something ugly. How far do we take it? Because a truth this concrete can be twisted, and I don't want to hand anyone a weapon. So let's set boundaries, and honestly, these boundaries should make you trust the whole argument more, not less. First, honor does not mean lifelong childlike obedience. Ephesians already separated the two. An adult owes his parents honor. He does not owe them the surrender of every decision as though he never grew up. Second, Mark 7 sets no universal dollar amount. There's no verse assigning a percentage of your income to your parents. The passage establishes a moral seriousness, not an accounting rule. Third, and this one matters deeply, none of this means staying inside an abusive or dangerous situation. Mark 7 confronts a man dodging a legitimate need with a religious excuse. It does not speak to a person protecting themselves from harm, manipulation, or genuine danger. Those situations involve questions this single passage was never meant to answer alone, and no one should use the fifth commandment as a chain. Fourth, resist the cartoon version of Corban, where the Pharisees simply stole everyone's money for the temple. The mechanics were more complicated and more disputed than that, and the caricature makes us dumber, not wiser. And fifth, don't overcorrect into claiming the command was written only for adults. It clearly reaches across the whole relationship, childhood included. The honest claim is just that its relevance never expired at adulthood, the way we often assume it did. Notice what all of that does. It makes the command broader, not more controlling. Honor can't mean do whatever your parents demand, and it can't mean say kind things while ignoring real needs. It's bigger and more demanding and more humane than either. So what, in the end, has Jesus changed about the way we hear 4 words we've known our whole lives? Bring the whole trail back together. At Sinai, honor your father and mother. In the wisdom writings, that responsibility follows the parent into old age and frailty. In Mark, a sacred-sounding vow can be turned into a machine for withholding help. In Matthew, that withholding is named, flatly, as failing to honor. And in Paul, children and grandchildren caring for vulnerable family is itself called godliness, something that pleases God. That's the theological destination. Jesus rejects the false choice between honoring God and doing what God has actually told us to do. A religious act does not become righteous just because his name got attached to it. Worship cannot be used to cancel obedience. You cannot dedicate your way out of a duty God assigned. And the deepest lesson is not give your parents money. That would shrink this back down to the size we started with. The discovery is larger. Genuine honor becomes concrete whenever circumstances require it to. Sometimes that's respectful words. Sometimes it's obedience. Sometimes it's patience with a parent whose mind is failing, which is exactly the situation an ancient Jewish writer named long before Jesus. Sometimes it's simply being present, and sometimes, yes, it's handing over resources you would honestly rather keep. Some of you watching are adult children, some are parents, some are both at once, caught in the middle, honoring upward while raising downward. The point isn't to leave here doing math about how much you send home. The more searching question is quieter than that. Does the way I actually treat my parents give them the weight my words claim they already have? Or do I honor them fluently with my lips, the way Isaiah's people honored God, while my hands stay closed? So come back one last time to where we began. An elderly hand, open, waiting. When this study started, that image looked like it was about money, and it felt strange that Jesus would explain the fifth commandment with resources at all. Now the same hand means something else. It's the gap between honor spoken and honor embodied. It's the distance a word has to travel to become an action.
And a single religious syllable, Corban, was invented to keep that distance from ever closing. Jesus' warning in Mark 7 was never that people cared too much about giving something to God. It was that they had found a holy-sounding way to avoid doing what God had already asked. Their lips honored him, their hands stayed shut, and their parents kept waiting. Lips, Corban, empty hands.
So maybe the real question isn't whether we say we honor our father and mother. We're fluent at that. The question Jesus presses into us is what happens on the day that honor finally has to leave our lips and pass through our hands. If this study gave you something worth keeping, subscribe so the next one finds you, and share it with someone who's carrying an aging parent right now. They may need to hear that what they're doing has a name in Scripture, and the name is honor. Thanks for spending this time in Mark 7 with me. God bless.